Putin news today. Russians believe Putin's hype? A U.S. covert operation. It was March 22 night as I drove into Kiev from Poland. Connections were patchy. I had to surf through social media to learn that shooters in an affluent Moscow mall were killing civilians. Already dead were dozens. Former Russian President Medvedev blamed Ukraine. Though ISIS promptly acknowledged responsibility and the Americans openly warned the Russians of an assault, Russian propaganda has only increased claims that Ukraine and the West were involved. The head of the Ukrainian National Security Council even claimed Ukraine will arrange additional fun in Russia in a Russian broadcast video. Video was AI deepfake. The Ukrainians I met believed the propaganda expected Putin would spread conspiracy theories and use the atrocity to hurt Ukraine. The next days saw severe attacks on Ukrainian citizens and energy systems. Russia fueled dread after the incident. But I worried how Russians would react. Would Kremlin propaganda sway them? Would telling them the truth be worth it? Since Putin, who vows to protect his people and insulates Moscow elites from conflict, authorized a big terror attack in an elite Moscow shopping center, he is vulnerable. Some polls show that 2 weeks after the atrocity, most Russians agree with the authorities that Ukraine and the West were responsible. However, dictatorships make polls harder. Other surveys by the same academics have found that many Russians listen to Putin because the government is right, merely because it is the government and it has power. When I lived in Russia in the 2000s, I was always amazed how people could hold different versions of truth depending on how private the talk was, or how drunk they were. Several terrorist attacks occurred in the 2000s. Russians privately suspected the Kremlin was behind them, and Putin used these occasions to justify harsher control and conflicts. Some suspected that the Kremlin itself spread the rumor that it was behind terrorist attacks. Putin would rather appear ruthless but powerful than weak and let terrorists to murder easily in Moscow. Multi-layer conspiracies thrive in Russia's complex political system. That makes it easier for the Kremlin to spread conspiracy theories, like the newest. If what you say you think is less about the truth and more about showing your loyalty, then perhaps polling is not the best way to study propaganda and the Russian people. Instead, look at how propaganda affects behavior, both physical and discursive. Data scientists combined Russian economic, social, and internet discourse data in a filter lab study I advised on. They found Kremlin propaganda vulnerabilities. Consider inflation. Russia is experiencing high inflation. Car prices have risen 15% since 2022. While Russian propaganda touts high salaries, online chatter demonstrates that people feel underpaid. Due to a lack of confidence in the currency's future, people are borrowing heavily in the hope of paying it off cheaply. Household debt is up 17% in 2023. Government propaganda tells individuals to save and avoid debt, but their actions demonstrate otherwise. Government campaigns struggle for momentum even when successful. Russian media has touted the country's medical treatment despite quality issues since the conflict. For a few weeks, such propaganda campaigns work, but then social media talk turns sour, and the Kremlin tries to revive it. With mobilization, the Kremlin promotes recruiting soldiers, which boosts internet opinion for a few weeks before falling again. This pattern reveals the Kremlin's need to regulate behavior and discourse and its effort to do so. Perhaps this is the best way to approach Russian public opinion. Measure it by how well the Kremlin can get people to repeat official narratives, not by belief. The Kremlin is more powerful when people repeat lies, despite not believing them. Kremlin elites fear losing control like the Soviet leadership in the late 1980s. Alexei Navalny constantly threatened the Kremlin. Everyone expects Kremlin officials to be corrupt, therefore his videos were unsurprising. His courage to express the unsayable was impressive. His power forced the Kremlin to kill him. Who can deliver Kremlin-challenging campaigns without Navalny? Should the West try them? Truth isn't important in these campaigns, it doesn't persuade Russians. It's about exposing the Kremlin. It has less information control than expected. We should view facts like military production, sanctions, or drone strikes. Ukrainian drones hitting Russian oil refineries show that Russia doesn't control its primary revenue sources. Moscow would reconsider its war risks if Ukraine's partners showed they could outproduce and penalize Russia. The Kremlin will reconsider the danger if we show that it can't control what Russians say and do. We cannot accomplish any of the above, save for Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil refineries. Kremlin outproduction, weak sanctions, and uncontested information control. Putin will calculate.